I'm Alex Porter, I'm 32 years old, and my own father once called me a useless son right before he gave my entire inheritance to my younger brother. But before I tell you how a simple, old compass turned the tables and exposed a rot that went deeper than I could have ever imagined, do me a favor and let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. It's always incredible to see how far these stories can reach. The storm that night wasn't just weather. It was an omen. Rain lashed against the towering windows of my father's estate, the wind howling a mournful, angry song. Each crack of thunder seemed to shake the very foundations of the house, a perfect soundtrack for the demolition of my life. Inside, the air was glacial. It was my father's 65th birthday party, but it felt more like a public execution. My execution. I was seated in a stiff, high-backed armchair, isolated from the main cluster of guests. The chair felt less like furniture and more like a defendant's dock. My hands were slick with a cold sweat, and a knot of dread in my stomach tightened with every passing minute. My Aunt Carol shot me a look from across the room, a pathetic little grimace that was supposed to pass for sympathy, before turning back to her champagne. No one wanted to be caught in the splash zone of my father's disapproval. My father, Richard Porter, stood before the grand marble fireplace, a king in his court. He was a man who seemed to defy age, his presence as solid and imposing as the granite mantle behind him. He raised his glass, and an expectant hush fell over the room. "Friends, family," he began, his voice a low baritone that commanded attention. "Thank you for coming to celebrate this milestone with me. 65 years. And for 40 of those years, I have poured my blood, my sweat, and my soul into building Porter Industries." His eyes scanned the room, landing briefly on each of his business associates, his cronies. Then they settled on me. The temperature in the room dropped another 10 degrees. "A legacy is a heavy thing," he continued, a cruel edge to his voice. "It requires strength, vision, a killer instinct. It must be passed into hands that are worthy, hands that will not tremble." His gaze was unwavering, pinning me to my chair. "These are qualities, as many of you know, that my eldest son, Alex, has unfortunately never managed to cultivate." The silence was deafening. My mother, Victoria, a portrait of polished elegance, flinched as if struck. Her hand fluttered to her pearl necklace, her eyes darting to the expensive rug at her feet. Anywhere but at me. My brother, Ethan, standing at our father's right hand, practically vibrated with anticipation. He was the golden child, the heir apparent, and this was his coronation. He met my eyes over the rim of his glass and gave me a slow, deliberate wink. "Ethan," my father boomed, clapping a hand on his shoulder, "understands the nature of power. He has the fire, the ambition." He gestured dramatically towards a massive mahogany desk where a leather-bound portfolio of documents sat. "Which is why I am proud to announce tonight that I am transferring my entire controlling interest in Porter Industries, this estate and all associated assets, to him. Effective immediately." A wave of polite, rehearsed applause rippled through the guests. It was the sound of sycophants celebrating a decision they'd likely known about for weeks. Ethan's grin was predatory. My father wasn't finished. He strode over to the desk and picked up a pen as if it were a scepter. "Alex," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear, "you are too soft, too emotional. You waste your time and my money on pointless charities. You are, to put it plainly, a useless son in a world that has no place for weakness." He signed the main document with a sharp, aggressive flourish. Then he pushed a single sheet of paper and the pen towards me. "This is a legal formality, a non-contention agreement. Your signature will confirm you understand your place and will make no future claims on what you have not earned." My throat felt like it was filled with sand. My whole body was trembling, a mix of rage and profound humiliation. I felt dozens of pairs of eyes on me, watching, waiting for the final collapse. "Just sign it. Just get it over with. Make the pain stop." My hand, slick with sweat, reached for the pen. The weight of my failure was crushing me. And that's when a quiet, reedy voice cut through the suffocating tension. "Richard," I would advise against that. It was Mr. Harold Caldwell, our family's lawyer for as long as I could remember. He was 72, a man who seemed to be made of tweed and quiet integrity. He stepped forward from the shadows near the library entrance, his expression deeply troubled. My father wheeled on him, his face darkening. Harold, this is a private family matter. It does not concern you. On the contrary, Mr. Caldwell said, his gaze finding mine and holding it. He took another step, placing himself between me and the desk. It concerns my primary fiduciary duty. He looked directly at me. Alex, do not sign that paper. Before you do anything, you need to be made aware of the full and binding articles of the Eleanor Porter Trust. The name Eleanor Porter fell into the charged atmosphere of the room and changed everything. My grandmother. The mere mention of her name was a rebuke to the raw, masculine power my father was wielding. She had been the quiet, steady heart of our family, and her absence for the past 5 years had left a void that my father had filled with ambition and noise. My father's face, a moment before flush with victory, tightened into a mask of disbelief. The Eleanor Trust? That was an educational fund for the grandchildren. It was dissolved upon her death. That is what you were led to believe, Richard, Mr. Caldwell said, his tone respectful but unyielding. The truth is more complex. He turned to me, his old eyes conveying a sense of urgency. Alex, may I have a word with you in the library? Alone. My father started to protest, but something in Caldwell's demeanor, a sudden assertion of authority I had never seen from him before, made him hesitate. I stood up on shaky legs and followed the old lawyer into the library, the heavy oak doors closing behind us with a soft, definitive click, shutting out the hostile world of the party. The library was my grandmother's sanctuary. It smelled of old leather, lemon polish, and her faint, lingering scent of lavender. It was the only room in the house that felt like a home. Sit down, son, Mr. Caldwell said, gesturing to one of the plush armchairs. He didn't sit himself. Instead, he paced for a moment, gathering his thoughts. Your grandmother, he began, his voice low and serious, was the most astute woman I have ever known. She loved you all, but she was not sentimental. She saw the path Richard was on. She saw his appetites, and she saw how he pitted you and Ethan against each other. She worried about what would happen to the company, her legacy, and to you after she was gone. He finally stopped pacing and looked at me. So she made provisions, a safeguard. He opened the worn leather briefcase he always carried and retrieved a thick, blue, string-bound folder. He laid it on the coffee table between us. The Eleanor Porter Trust was never just an educational fund. That was a cover. The trust is, and has always been, the holding entity for 51% of the voting shares of Porter Industries. I could only stare. My brain refused to process the words. 51%. A controlling interest. It was impossible. But Dad always said he had total control. How could that be possible? Because your grandmother was the original silent partner, Caldwell explained. It was her inheritance that provided the seed capital for your grandfather to start the business decades ago. She held the majority stake from day one. When she passed, she didn't bequeath those shares to Richard directly. She knew he would squander the moral authority of the company. Instead, she placed them in this trust and named me the sole trustee, bound by the charter she wrote. My mind was a whirlwind. It felt like the floor had dropped out from under me, only to be replaced by something solid I never knew existed. There is a particular article in the charter, Mr. Caldwell continued, his finger tracing a line on the cover of the folder. Article 4, Section B. I helped her draft it myself. We came to call it the Morality Clause. It stipulates that the trustee, myself, is bound to review the leadership of the primary beneficiary, which is your father. And if the primary beneficiary commits an act of gross and demonstrable injustice against a direct family heir, an act such as public humiliation and coercive disinheritance without just and proven cause, then the trustee is not only empowered, but is obligated to initiate proceedings to transfer the control of the trust to the wronged party. He looked at me, his meaning crystal clear. Tonight, Alex, your father didn't just disinherit you. He handed you the keys to the kingdom. Or rather, he handed you the key to the courthouse door. This is not an instant victory, he warned, his voice grave. This is the declaration of war. He will fight this with every lawyer, every dollar, every dirty trick he has. But for the first time in your life, son, you have the high ground and the ammunition. My hand, of its own accord, slipped into my pocket and closed around the familiar weight of the old brass compass my grandmother had given me. This metal was cool and smooth against my skin. The memory it conjured was so vivid, it was like stepping back in time. I was 16. My father had presented me with a ridiculously expensive sports car for my birthday, tossing the keys on the table and saying, "Try not to wreck it. It's a bigger asset than you are." The words were meant to be a joke, but they landed like a punch to the gut. I remember smiling weakly while Ethan clapped me on the back, his eyes gleaming with jealousy and derision. Later that day, Grandmother Eleanor found me by the lake on the edge of the property, skipping stones across the water. She didn't say a word for a long time. She just stood beside me watching the ripples spread. "He doesn't know how to love without assessing value," she'd said finally, her voice soft. "It's his great flaw. He sees a sun and he checks the stock price. He sees a sunset and he wonders what the property is worth." She then pressed the heavy brass compass into my hand. It was old, clearly an antique, with a face that was both intricate and beautifully simple. "The world your father operates in has a compass," she told me, her sharp blue eyes meeting mine. "It points to profit, points to power. It's a very simple, very reliable compass, and it has made him a wealthy man. But it can lead a soul to a very cold, very empty place at the end of the journey." She gently closed my fingers around the compass. "This one is different. Its needle doesn't point to what is profitable. Points to what is right. Points to your true north. There will be times, Alex, many times, when you will be lost, when the world will shout at you to follow its compass. In those moments," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, "be quiet, hold this, and trust where it points. It will never, ever lead you astray." Now, standing in her library, the full weight of her foresight, her brilliant, loving strategy, crashed down on me. This trust wasn't just a legal document. It was a map she had left me, a weapon she had forged for a battle she knew I would one day have to fight. The library doors burst open, splintering the quiet moment. My father stood there, his face a mask of purple rage. Two of his corporate lawyers, men I recognized from company Christmas parties, stood behind him like gargoyles. "Harold, you are fired. Your services are no longer required. You are trespassing," my father roared. He then rounded on me, jabbing a finger in my direction. "And you think you can pull this stunt? This little fantasy your senile grandmother cooked up? I will bury you. I will bury you in legal fees until you are begging me for forgiveness. You will be nothing." The sheer force of his fury was a physical thing. The old, conditioned fear rose in my throat, the instinct to shrink, to apologize, to make myself small and disappear. It would be so easy to give in, so easy to surrender and have it all be over. But then I felt the solid weight of the compass in my palm. Trust where it points. I took a breath. I straightened my shoulders, and I looked my father squarely in the eye, not as a frightened boy, but as an equal. "You can't fire him, Dad," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "He doesn't work for you. He works for the trust. And so do I." I turned to Mr. Caldwell, ignoring my father's sputtering rage. "What's our first move, Harold?" My father stared at me, his mouth opening and closing silently. For the first time, the look in his eyes wasn't just disappointment or anger. It was something new. It was the dawning, terrifying realization that the pawn he had just swept off the board had suddenly been promoted to a queen, and it was ready to play the game. The next morning, the battle lines were drawn in stark, humiliating fashion. I received a formal, chillingly polite email from the head of security at Porter Industries. Subject: Notice of Revocation of Access. The email informed me that, effective immediately, my credentials were void and I was not to attempt entry to any company properties. It was signed by a man who used to give me candy when I was a kid visiting my father's office. Just to confirm the reality of it, I drove to the gleaming, 60-story glass tower that bore my family's name. I walked into the cavernous marble lobby, a place I'd run through as a child, and approached the main security desk. Frank, the guard who had been there for 20 years, looked up and his face fell. "Mr. Porter," he said, his voice low, his eyes fixed on his monitor. I can't let you up. It's Alex, Frank, and I own 51% of this building," I said, trying to keep my voice even, though a hot wave of shame was creeping up my neck. "I'm sorry, sir," he mumbled, refusing to look at me. "My orders are from Mr. Richard Porter and Mr. Ethan Porter. They said to call the police for trespassing if you refuse to leave." Trespassing. In my own company. It was a brutal, effective power play. My father was demonstrating that my piece of paper meant nothing against his actual physical control of the board, the security, the entire infrastructure. I was a king with no country and no army. Defeated, I retreated to a noisy, anonymous diner that became my makeshift war room. Mr. Caldwell met me there, his face looking even more weary than the night before. He slid a thick stack of papers across the sticky table. "He's not wasting any time," Caldwell sighed. "He's filed 3 motions. The first challenges the validity of the trust's morality clause, calling it vague and unenforceable. The second petitions to have me removed as trustee, citing a conflict of interest and senility." I flinched at that. "The third," he said, tapping the top sheet, "is a request for a temporary restraining order to prevent you from contacting any company employees or board members, framing you as a disgruntled and potentially unstable element seeking to disrupt corporate operations." "Can he do all that?" I asked, the sheer legal firepower aimed at us making me feel dizzy. "He can file anything he wants. He has a law firm on $1 million a year retainer. We have me and a shoebox of your grandmother's meticulously kept records." Caldwell stirred his coffee. "His strategy is clear. Bankrupt us before we even get to court. It's called strategic litigation against public participation. Except in this case, he's using it against his own son." A cold dread settled in my stomach. He was right. We couldn't win a war of attrition. We had to change the battlefield. "We can't win this just in the courthouse," I said, an idea taking shape. "We need to win it in the boardroom. We have to prove to the board of directors that my father and Ethan are not just unjust, but incompetent. That their leadership is a direct threat to the company's bottom line. We need leverage." "Leverage," Caldwell repeated, a flicker of interest in his eyes. "And where do we get that when we're locked out of the castle?" "We find the people they threw out of the castle," I said. My first target was Sarah Chen. I remembered her well. She was a brilliant, no-nonsense operations manager, universally respected, who had been on the fast track to a senior VP position. Then, about a year ago, she was suddenly gone. The official story was a corporate restructuring. The whispers in the hallways told a different story. She had a major blow-up with Ethan over the budget for his pet project, a new logistics division. It took me 2 days of digging through old social media contacts to find her current address. It was a modest duplex in a quiet suburb, a world away from the executive lifestyle she'd once had. When I knocked on her door, she answered looking wary, dressed in jeans and a faded university sweatshirt. "Sarah Chen." Her eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Yes, who's asking?" "I'm Alex Porter." Recognition flashed in her eyes, immediately followed by a wall of sheer hostility. "Oh, I know who you are. What in God's name do you want with me?" "I need your help," I said, deciding directness was the only approach. I explained the situation quickly, the disinheritance, the trust, the legal battle. She laughed, a short, bitter sound. "You want my help to fight your daddy? That's rich. Let me give you some advice, kid. Walk away. You have no idea what you're up against. I know they fired you because you wouldn't sign off on Ethan's numbers for the logistics expansion," I pressed. "You saw something crooked. And you called him on it. Her face hardened. Look, I signed a non-disclosure agreement that could bankrupt me 10 times over if I break it. I have a mortgage. I have kids. I finally landed a new job after being blacklisted for 6 months. I am not committing career suicide for your family soap opera. Goodbye, Alex. She started to close the door. It was a clear, final dismissal. They are destroying that company, Sarah, I said, my voice rising with desperation. You know Ethan is a fraud. You know my father enables him. This isn't just about me. It's about a company we both, at one time, cared about. My grandmother left me a tool to fix it, but I don't know how to use it. You do. I took a breath. When I get control, and I will get control, I'm cleaning house. I'll need a new chief operating officer. Someone with a spine. Someone who knows where the bodies are buried. I saw a flicker in her eyes. The fighter was still in there, but fear won out. It's too big a risk, she said softly, and closed the door in my face. I walked away feeling utterly dejected. She was my best shot, and she turned me down flat. For the next week, the only progress was a mounting pile of legal bills from Mr. Caldwell's office for filing our responses. Hope was beginning to feel like a luxury I couldn't afford. I was paying the fees by selling off the few valuable things I owned, like the expensive watch my mother had given me. Then, I got a break from the most unexpected of sources. My phone rang with an unknown number. Is this Alex? A woman's voice asked, hesitant and heavily accented. Yes. Who is this? This is Rosa, from the cleaning staff, at the main building. Rosa. She was a sweet woman in her late 60s who always had a kind word for me, one of the few people in that building who saw me as a person, not a title. Rosa, you shouldn't be calling me. You could get in trouble. I'm retiring in 3 months, she said, a new strength in her voice. What are they going to do? I've worked for this family for 30 years. I saw you and your brother grow up. I know who has a good heart. She paused. I clean Mr. Ethan's office. He is a very messy boy, and a stupid one. He throws away receipts. So many receipts from fancy dinners at Capitol Grill and the Palm. With that man, Mr. Reynolds, the one your father hates. Marcus Reynolds, my father's arch-nemesis in the industry. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just mismanagement. This was treason. And another thing, Rosa continued, he shreds so much paper, but sometimes he misses a piece. I found this in the trash can. It looked important. We met an hour later at a bus stop. She slipped me a crumpled, slightly coffee-stained piece of paper. It was a fragment of a shipping invoice from Ethan's logistics division. It listed a shipment of high-end electronics to a warehouse in Delaware. But the client code and the payment authorization numbers were ones I'd never seen before. They weren't standard Porter Industries codes. It was a tiny breadcrumb, but it was the first piece of actual evidence I had. It was proof of something happening off the books. That night, armed with this new information, I called Sarah Chen again. I'm not interested, Alex, she said, her voice tired. Just listen for 1 minute. Ethan is meeting with Marcus Reynolds, and he's running some kind of ghost shipments through his logistics division. I have a piece of an invoice. I have a witness. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. A witness who will testify in court? She asked, the sharp edge of the operations manager returning to her voice. No, I admitted. A cleaning lady who is terrified and retiring in 3 months. And a crumpled piece of paper. Another silence. I could hear her thinking, the gears turning. Okay, she said finally, and I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. This is what we're going to do. The paper is our starting point. We need to find out what that client code is. We need to follow the money. Forget the courthouse for now. We're going on a hunt. A spark of something I hadn't felt in weeks ignited inside me. It was hope. I finally had an ally. The hunt had begun. Sarah's entry into my one-man war effort was like bringing a special forces commander into a knife fight. She was methodical, relentless, and utterly brilliant. She turned my tiny, grim apartment into a command center. We had a whiteboard covered in flowcharts, company names, and question marks. She operated on the principle that every corporate system has a crack, and our job was to find it. Ethan is arrogant and sloppy, she explained during one of our late-night strategy sessions, fueled by cheap coffee and takeout. He believes he's untouchable, so he won't have covered his tracks perfectly. We just have to pull on the right thread. The thread was the ghost shipment to the Delaware warehouse. Sarah used a contact from a past life to run the address. The warehouse was owned by a shell corporation called Apex Logistics. A few more hours of digging online revealed Apex Logistics was a subsidiary of another company, Viridian Holdings, which, after peeling back another 3 layers of corporate nesting dolls, was secretly owned by none other than Marcus Reynolds. He's not just sabotaging the company, I said, a sick feeling rising in my stomach. He's using Porter Industries' resources, our trucks, our fuel, our staff, to run a side business for our biggest competitor. It's worse than that, Sarah said, pointing to the screen. He's likely cooking the books inside the logistics division to hide the operational costs, which means he's committing wire fraud and embezzlement. This is jail time territory, Alex. But having a theory and having proof that would stand up in court were 2 different things. We had a trail, but we needed the smoking gun. And just as we were starting to make progress, my father and Ethan dropped the bomb. The attack came from a direction I never expected. It wasn't about the company. It was about me. A slick, well-produced investigative report aired on a conservative news channel known for its loyalty to my father. It was a 10-minute segment dedicated to portraying me as a pathetic, bleeding heart failure whose charitable endeavors were mismanaged and possibly fraudulent. They interviewed a disgruntled former volunteer from my youth shelter, who, I later learned, had been paid $10,000 for his testimony. They twisted my modest successes into failures and my intentions into schemes. The segment ended with a somber-looking financial analyst, concluding that my legal challenge against my father was nothing more than a desperate attempt by a failed idealist to get his hands on the family money he could never earn himself. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. The small donors who had supported my shelter for years started calling, confused and angry. The board of the shelter, a group of good people who were now under immense pressure, called an emergency meeting and asked me to step down pending an investigation. I had to do it. The thing I was most proud of, the one corner of my life that felt pure and my own, was now tainted, used as a weapon to destroy me. That was the week the legal bills finally broke me. I'd sold everything of value. I was 3 months behind on rent. The eviction notice taped to my door felt like a final surrender flag. I hit my low point on a Tuesday night. It was raining again, a miserable, cold drizzle. I was sitting on the floor of my dark apartment because the power had been cut off. The only light came from my phone's screen. I was looking at a picture of me and my grandmother, taken on my 20th birthday. We were both smiling. She looked so proud. A wave of absolute, soul-crushing despair washed over me. I was failing her. I was failing myself. The world was a cold, hard place, just like my father always said, and I was too soft for it. He had won. He had systematically dismantled my reputation, my finances, and now my spirit. I thought about the compass in my pocket. Trust where it points. Felt like a mockery now. Where was it pointing? To a dark apartment, an eviction notice, and total abject failure. My phone buzzed. It was Mr. Caldwell. "Alex," he said, his voice grave. "Richard's lawyers have filed a motion for summary judgment. They're claiming our case has no merit and are asking the judge to dismiss it outright. The hearing is in 2 weeks. If we don't present concrete, undeniable evidence of malfeasance, we're done. The judge will throw it out." The last bit of fight in me fizzled out. It was over. We had nothing concrete, just threads and theories. "I can't, Harold," I whispered into the phone, my voice cracking. "I'm done. He wins." "Don't you dare say that, son." Caldwell's voice was sharp. "You don't quit. Not now." But I barely heard him. I hung up the phone and just sat there in the dark, hollowed out. I was a 32-year-old man who had lost everything because he dared to believe he was worth more than his father's valuation of him. And he'd been wrong. There was a knock on the door. Firm. Insistent. "Go away." I yelled, my voice raw. The knocking stopped. A moment later, a key turned in the lock. The door opened, and Sarah Chun stood there, silhouetted by the dim hallway light. My landlord must have let her in. Get out, Sarah, I said, not even looking at her. The war is over. We lost. She didn't leave. She walked in, her eyes adjusting to the darkness. She saw the eviction notice on the table, the scattered papers. She saw the state I was in. She didn't say, I told you so. She didn't offer platitudes. She just sat down on the floor across from me and said, then we've got 2 weeks to find a miracle. Her quiet, unshakable belief in me, even then, in my darkest moment, was a lifeline I didn't know I needed. But it still felt impossible. A miracle won't be enough, I said. Then maybe this will help, a new voice said from the doorway. An elderly man stepped in behind Sarah. It was Thomas Wright, the ex-board member she'd mentioned. He was holding a file. I've been talking to some old friends, Thomas said, his voice a low rumble. People from your grandfather's day who Richard forced out. It seems your father's habit of destroying family isn't new. He sat down and opened the file. I'm sorry to have to be the one to tell you this, Alex, but you need to understand who you're fighting. And then he told me the story of David Porter, my uncle, Richard's older brother. The story was even worse than I could have imagined. David hadn't just been pushed out of the business. Richard had systematically ruined him. He'd used company funds to start a whisper campaign, accusing David of having a gambling problem. He'd engineered a fake supply chain crisis to make David's division look incompetent. He'd pushed his own brother into bankruptcy and disgrace. David had lost his family, his home, his reputation. He died of a heart attack at 45, a broken man. Richard has a deep-seated pathology, Thomas said, his eyes filled with a profound sadness. He equates compassion with a weakness so dangerous it must be eradicated. He didn't just disagree with his brother. He saw him as a disease in the family and cut him out like a cancer. He looks at you, Alex, and he sees David's ghost. He's not just trying to win a business dispute. In his twisted mind, he's trying to save the family from you. The story didn't fill me with hate. Filled me with a chilling, absolute clarity. This was never about me being soft. This was about my father's own personal demons. The ghost of a sin so profound that he had to keep killing his brother, over and over again, in me. A new strength, cold and hard as steel, forged itself in the pit of my stomach. This was no longer about an inheritance or proving my worth. This was about stopping a cycle of destruction. Okay, I said, looking from Sarah to Thomas, my voice devoid of its earlier despair. 2 weeks. Where do we start? Sarah smiled, a grim, determined smile. We start with the man who helped Richard bury his brother. The one man who knows every dirty secret in that company's history because he helped create them. We start with James Harrison, the CFO. Approaching James Harrison was like trying to pet a cornered rattlesnake. He was my father's longest-serving lieutenant, a man who had survived decades in a corporate shark tank by being colder and more calculating than anyone else. He was the architect of the impenetrable financial structures my father used to hide his secrets. He was utterly complicit, and, as Sarah pointedly noted, that made him uniquely vulnerable. A man like Harrison has one allegiance. To himself, she reasoned, as we mapped out our strategy on the whiteboard. He helped your father oust David. He's helped him hide profits for years. He's loyal as long as Richard is the winning horse. Our job is to convince him he's backed the wrong one, and that we're offering him the only lifeboat off a sinking ship. Our approach couldn't be a direct confrontation. It had to be a surgical strike designed to maximize his paranoia. Thomas Wright, through his old network, found out that Harrison was an avid and very private art collector. He had a scheduled, off-the-books appointment at a high-end gallery in the city that Friday. On Thursday night, we made our move. We sent a single, anonymous email to Harrison's private, encrypted email address, an address Sarah had managed to acquire from a disgruntled IT tech who owed her a favor. The email had no subject and no body text. It just had one attachment, A scanned copy of the crumpled shipping invoice Rosa had found, the one with the ghost client code. We underlined the warehouse address in Delaware, the one we'd linked to Marcus Reynolds. That was it. We didn't make a threat. We didn't make an offer. We just showed him we had a piece of the puzzle, letting his own guilty conscience imagine how many other pieces we held. The next day, I went to the art gallery. I didn't go in. I just sat in a coffee shop across the street, waiting. Right on schedule, Harrison's black town car pulled up. He got out, looking tense, and hurried inside. I gave him 20 minutes. Then I walked across the street and went in. The gallery was a quiet, sterile space. I found Harrison in a back room, examining a large, abstract canvas. He saw my reflection in the glass frame before he saw me. He spun around, his face a mixture of shock and fury. "What the hell are you doing here?" he hissed, his eyes darting around to see if we were alone. "I'm developing an appreciation for art, James," I said calmly. "It's amazing what you can find if you look closely. Hidden signatures, underlying sketches, hidden accounts." His face went pale. "I don't know what you're talking about. You need to leave. Now." "I think you do," I said, stepping closer. "I know about Apex Logistics. I know about the Delaware warehouse. And I know you've been signing off on the divisional reports for Ethan's logistics group, knowing they're fraudulent. That's not just corporate malfeasance, James. That's conspiracy to commit fraud. That's a federal crime. The SEC might let my father off with a fine, but they will send the CFO who cooked the books to prison." I let that hang in the air. "The hearing for summary judgment is in less than 2 weeks. My father is going to throw Ethan under the bus to save himself. And who do you think they are both going to point the finger at when the feds start asking who made the numbers work? The man who designed the entire system." He stared at me, his mind clearly racing, calculating the odds, running the scenarios. I could see the exact moment his allegiance shifted. His survival instinct kicked in. "What do you want?" he finally whispered. "Everything," I said. "Every ledger, every email, every off-the-books account. I want full transactional immunity for your testimony and a generous severance package. You give me Richard and Ethan and you walk away clean. You stick with them and you go down with the ship." He didn't agree immediately. He just gave a curt nod and walked out of the gallery, his face like stone. The hook was set. All we could do was wait to see if he'd take the bait. The night before the hearing, a single, encrypted file appeared in Sarah's inbox. The sender was anonymous. The file was titled Corporate Governance Review. It was the motherlode. Harrison had come through. The courtroom was a cold, impersonal chamber that smelled of floor wax and anxiety. My father, Ethan, and their team of lawyers sat at one table, looking confident and smug. My father gave me a dismissive glance, as if I were a bug he was about to swat. At our table, it was just me and Mr. Caldwell. The judge, a stern-faced woman named Judge Marion Hawes, looked down at us over her spectacles. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, her voice sharp with impatience, "Porter Industries has filed for summary judgment, claiming your client's case is frivolous and without evidence. I am inclined to agree. You have 10 minutes to convince me otherwise before I dismiss this case." Mr. Caldwell stood, but I placed a hand on his arm. "I'll handle this, Harold," I whispered. I stood up, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Your Honor," I began, my voice steady. "This case is not about a family grievance. It is about a profound and sustained breach of fiduciary duty that puts a publicly traded company at severe risk." I started by laying out the evidence of Ethan's collusion with Marcus Reynolds, the restaurant receipts, the hotel bills, the shell corporations. My father's lead lawyer kept objecting. "Hearsay, no foundation." But the judge waved him off, a flicker of interest on her face. "This is nothing but a conspiracy theory from a desperate young man," my father's lawyer thundered. "Is it?" I asked, turning to the defense table. "Ethan, why don't you tell the court about the slush fund you used to pay for your PR campaign against me? Or would you rather I submit the sworn testimony from your former assistant who managed the payments?" Ethan turned sheet white. My father shot him a look of pure venom. But I was just getting started. This was the moment I had been waiting for. But my brother's actions, Your Honor, are just a symptom of a much deeper disease. A disease of corruption that starts at the very top. I looked directly at my father. For 20 years, the Porter Charitable Foundation has been lauded as a pillar of the community. In reality, it has been nothing more than a private piggy bank and a massive tax fraud scheme, designed and run by one man. Its chairman, Richard Porter. The room erupted. My father leaped to his feet. Lies. This is slander. He has no proof. On the contrary, I said, nodding to Mr. Caldwell, who slid a thick binder up to the clerk. We have proof. We have every transaction, every offshore account, every falsified report. All provided by a senior executive who will testify to the fact that he was ordered by Richard Porter to cook the books for 2 decades. I turned back to my father. His face had gone from red with rage to a ghastly, waxy gray. The Titan wasn't just crumbling. He was dissolving before my eyes. He knew exactly who the source had to be. He looked down the table at his lawyers, at his son, and he knew with absolute certainty that he was utterly and completely alone. Judge Hawes stared down at the binder the clerk had given her, her eyes wide. She looked up at my father, then at me. Her expression was no longer impatient. It was one of cold, hard fury. Motion for summary judgment is denied, she said, her voice like cracking ice. And I am referring this evidence to the U.S. Attorney's Office and the Securities and Exchange Commission. Effective immediately. She banged her gavel, the sound echoing the final, crashing end of my father's reign. Leaving the courthouse felt like surfacing after being underwater for too long. The air was sharp and cold, and the sounds of the city seemed unnaturally loud. My father and Ethan were swarmed by reporters who had gotten wind of the bombshell dropped in the courtroom. I saw my father's face, a mask of stunned disbelief, as his lawyers shoved him into a waiting car. He was no longer a titan of industry. He was just another rich man in trouble. Mr. Caldwell and I slipped out a side door. He clapped me on the shoulder, his old eyes shining. Eleanor would be so proud of you, son, he said, his voice thick with emotion. The board of directors convened an emergency session via video conference that afternoon. It was a short, somber meeting. With the threat of a federal investigation looming, they acted swiftly and decisively. Richard Porter was removed as CEO and chairman, and his position on the board was terminated, effective immediately. Ethan was fired. The morality clause of the Eleanor Porter Trust was officially enacted, and I was named interim chief executive officer. The news was a strange, hollow victory. I had won. I had taken back my birthright. But the cost was the complete and utter destruction of my family as I knew it. My first act as CEO wasn't a triumphant speech or a press conference. It was a meeting with Ethan. I had him come to the office, the same office our father had ruled from for 40 years. He looked small and lost in the cavernous room, like a child in his father's oversized suit. He sat hunched in a chair, avoiding my gaze. "So, what happens now?" he finally asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Are you going to send me to jail?" The question hung in the air between us. A part of me, a dark, vengeful part that had been nourished by years of my father's cruelty, wanted to say yes. It wanted to see him pay for every smirk, every lie, every moment of humiliation. It would have been the Porter thing to do. It would have been what my father would have done. And that's why I couldn't do it. "No, Ethan," I said, my voice softer than I expected. "The company will not be pressing criminal charges. The U.S. attorney will do what he's going to do, but we won't add to it." He looked up, his eyes filled with a shocked, desperate gratitude. "But you are done here," I said, my tone hardening. "Your severance will be the legal minimum. You will sign a new, ironclad NDA, and then you will disappear. I suggest you use this as an opportunity, maybe the first one you've ever really had, to figure out who you are when you're not trying to be a cheap copy of him." He just nodded, unable to speak. He stood up, and for a moment I thought he might say something, apologize, explain, anything. But he just turned and walked out of the office, out of the company, and out of my life. The golden child had finally tarnished. That night, I didn't go to my father's empty estate or a fancy hotel. I went back to my dingy little apartment to pack my things. As I was taping up the last box, there was a tentative knock on the door. I opened it to find my mother standing there. She looked frail, stripped of her usual socialite armor. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and she clutched her handbag like a life raft. "I saw the news," she said. "Your father, he's locked himself in his study. He won't speak to me." "I'm sorry to hear that, Mom," I said, and I meant it. She wrung her hands, a gesture of anxiety I knew so well. "Alex, I know I know I let you down. So many times. I was a coward. It's easier, to be quiet, to not make waves. Richard, he doesn't like waves." "I know," I said. She fumbled in her handbag and pulled out a small, worn leather book. It was an old-fashioned checkbook register. She held it out to me with a trembling hand. "I wanted you to see this, so you know." I took it from her, confused. I opened it. Inside, in my mother's perfect, looping script, was a meticulously kept record of checks. Cash. The amounts were small, $50, $75, never more than $100. They were dated weekly, going back more than a decade. "What is this?" I asked. "It was the grocery money," she whispered, a tear rolling down her cheek. "Richard always gave me a set amount in cash every week. For the household. I was a better shopper than he thought. I always managed to save a little. Every week, I would deposit it into a separate account he didn't know about." My eyes scanned the notes she'd made in the margins. For the youth shelter's new roof. Winter coats for the kids. Books for the after-school program. It was her. All those years, the small, anonymous donations that had kept my little charity afloat, they had come from her. They had come from skimmed grocery money. I looked up at her, my throat thick with an emotion I couldn't name. It was so much more than the money. It was the effort, the risk, the quiet, secret rebellion she had waged for years, in the only way she could. "You were proud of me," I said, the realization hitting me with the force of a physical blow. "I was always so proud of you, Alex," she sobbed, her composure finally breaking. "You were the one who had her heart. You had your grandmother's heart. I was just never, ever brave enough to say it out loud." I closed the distance between us and wrapped my arms around her. She felt as fragile as a bird. She clung to me, her body shaking with the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. It didn't fix the past. It didn't erase the years of pain silence. But it was a beginning. In the ruins of our broken family, we had found a single, surviving beam to start rebuilding from. The year that followed was the most difficult and rewarding of my life. Reforming a company with a culture as toxic as Porter Industries was like performing an organ transplant on a running patient. There were days of intense struggle, of pushing against a system that was deeply resistant to change. The federal investigation cast a long shadow. My father, through some slick legal maneuvering, avoided jail time. Instead, he was hit with a staggering fine that wiped out the majority of his personal fortune and a lifetime ban from serving as an officer or director of any public company. His name, once a symbol of power, was now synonymous with corporate disgrace. He retreated to the country estate, a king without a kingdom. My first order of business as CEO was a company-wide town hall. I stood before the thousands of employees, not as a conqueror, but as a reformer. I laid everything bare. The financial misconduct, the toxic leadership, the culture of fear. I admitted our failures and I outlined a new path forward, a new north for Porter Industries, based on the principles of transparency, integrity, and respect. Many were skeptical. They'd heard corporate jargon before. But then we started acting. With Sarah Chun, my brilliant and indispensable COO, we completely overhauled the company's ethics and compliance programs. We invested millions in our workforce, raising wages, improving benefits, and creating real pathways for advancement. We fired the executives who were loyalists to my father's old way of doing things and promoted talented people from within who had been overlooked for years. Slowly, miraculously, the culture began to heal. The suspicion and backstabbing were replaced by a tentative collaboration. Innovation, which had been stifled for years, began to flourish. And our profits, after an initial dip, began to climb to levels my father had never reached. It turned out that a company that valued its people was also a company that was highly profitable. I made good on my promise to my grandmother. The Eleanor Porter Foundation was reborn. It was no longer a slush fund, but a transparent and powerful force for good, supporting education and community development initiatives across the country. It became the soul of the new Porter Industries. My fractured family was also on a slow path to healing. Ethan had, to my surprise, taken my advice. He moved to Oregon, checked himself into therapy, and was now working for an environmental nonprofit. He sent me an email once a month. They were short, awkward updates, but they were honest. He was, for the first time, building a life that was his own. My mother blossomed. Freed from my father's oppressive shadow, she enrolled in university and was finishing the art history degree she'd abandoned 40 years earlier. We had dinner once a week, and our conversations were filled with a new, easy laughter. We were getting to know each other all over again. The one person I had no contact with was my father. He remained a silent exile in his country manner. I had tried calling once, but he hadn't picked up. One crisp autumn day, about a year after the court hearing, I found myself driving towards the old family cemetery. It was something I did a few times a year, a quiet pilgrimage to my grandmother's grave. As I pulled up the long, winding drive, I saw a familiar black car parked near the entrance. My heart beat a little faster. I parked at a distance and walked up the grassy hill, staying behind a line of old maple trees. And there he was, my father. He was standing before the side-by-side graves of my grandparents, his back to me. He looked frail, his once imposing shoulders stooped. He stood there for a long, long time, motionless. Then, he did something I never would have expected. He took a step to the side, to a small, almost forgotten patch of grass next to his parents. There was a simple, flat stone there, one I hadn't paid much attention to since I was a child. It was the grave of his brother, my Uncle David. My father knelt down, a difficult, painful movement for a man his age. He reached out and with a gloved hand, he brushed some fallen leaves from the stone plaque. He just stayed there, kneeling, for what felt like an eternity. He wasn't crying. He wasn't speaking. He was just present, in the presence of the brother he had destroyed. Finally, he pushed himself back up, his movements stiff. He gave one last look at the three graves, his mother, his father, and his brother, and then turned and walked slowly, heavily, back to his car. I waited until he was long gone before I approached. Lying at the base of my grandmother's headstone was a small bouquet of white roses. And next to it, on David's grave, was an identical bouquet. No apology could ever be enough. No words could ever mend what was broken. But that silent, solitary act of contrition, that quiet acknowledgement of all his ghosts, was a language I could understand. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't redemption. It was just a flicker of light in a lifetime of darkness. And for now, it was enough. The boardroom at Porter Industries is a different place now. The long, rectangular table, designed for a king to sit at its head, is gone. In its place is a large, round oak table. There are no heads, just equals. I was in a quarterly review meeting this morning. Our head of product development, a young, brilliant woman named Maria who had been repeatedly passed over for promotion by the old guard, was passionately laying out her vision for a new line of products built on sustainable, recycled materials. It was a bold, risky idea. It would require a huge initial investment and would take years to pay off. Under my father's reign, she wouldn't have even been in the room. If she had been, she would have been laughed at for prioritizing long-term sustainability over short-term profit. But here, today, the team was leaning in. They were challenging her, yes, but they were also building on her idea, excited by its potential. They were collaborating. My gaze drifted to the corner of my blotter. There, sitting on a small wooden stand, was my grandmother's compass. It was the first thing I had placed in my new office. Its needle, as always, pointed a steady, unwavering north. I finally understood the depth of her gift. She hadn't just left me a legal tool. She had left me a moral one. My father's compass had only two directions, more and power. It had led him to a vast, wealthy, and desperately lonely island. My compass, the one she had taught me to read, pointed toward a different kind of wealth. It pointed toward integrity, toward community, toward building something that didn't just make a profit but made a difference. The journey here almost destroyed me. It forced me to confront the man I feared I would become and to fight for the man I hoped I could be. I had to lose a father to finally stop being a son. In winning control of a company, I finally won control of my own life. My name is Alex Porter. I'm 33, and for the first time I am not defined by who my father is or who my brother is or who they told me I was. I am defined by the choices I make every day, by the direction I choose to steer. My true north is clear, and that is a legacy far more valuable than any inheritance. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope it reached you in some meaningful way. It's a strange thing, family, and the paths we have to walk to find our own place in the world. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to fight to prove your own worth, especially against the people who were supposed to believe in you the most? I'd be honored to read your story in the comments below. And if this resonated with you, please consider hitting the like button or subscribing for more stories. Truly means the world.